The Progress in International Reading Literacy study has been released. Professor Nic Spaull from the Economics Department at Stellenbosch University is going to take us through it. Welcome, Professor.
Thanks for having me.
What are the main findings?
So the main findings from the PIRLS study is that it tells us every 5 years what are our reading results. So the last time we participated in PIRLS was in 2016, and that study showed that 78% of grade 4 children in South Africa couldn't read in any language. And the latest round, which was done in 2021, shows that that's increased to 81%. So even more children can't read. And this is largely because of the pandemic, the school closures, and rotational timetables. Another way of discussing the results is to say that the average grade 4 child in 2021 is about 80% of a year of learning behind the average South African grade 4 child from 2016. So they're nearly an entire year behind their counterparts from 2016. There's a variety of other findings as well. There was an increase in inequality. We see big gender gaps between boys and girls, with girls doing much better than boys in reading, almost a year and a half better than reading. And also, I'm sure your listeners would be very interested to find out how we compare to other middle-income countries like Jordan or Egypt or Brazil. And one of the findings was that the average South African grade 4 kid is about 3 years behind the average grade 4 kid in Brazil, which is a country that we like to compare ourselves to. It's a similar GDP per capita, also has high levels of inequality. So some of these findings are extremely concerning.
What are the main causes of this?
So I think most people would correctly say that this was a COVID-19 pandemic was the main reason for the decline. So between 2006, which was the very first time that we participated in PIRLS, between 2006 to 2011 to 2016, we actually saw an improving trend in South Africa. So the schooling system was getting better over time. And we also see that in other surveys like the Trends in International Mathematics and Science Studies. So it was also showing improvements in maths and science. And then when the pandemic hit in 2020 and in 2021, there was this huge setback. And schools were closed for a large part of the year in 2020. And then in 2021, we had rotational timetables where children were only going to school every second day. And those rotational timetables were really bad for children in no-fee schools, because when those kids weren't in school, they weren't learning anything. Whereas kids that were attending private schools or fee-charging public schools that had access to the internet at home, they have more resources at home, their parents and their teachers could help them continue learning even when they weren't at school. That's one of the reasons why we see this gap emerging between English and Afrikaans schools, which are often fee-charging schools, and African home language schools. Because what PIRLS does is it tests children in whatever the language of the school was in grades 1 to 3. In South Africa, about 70% of children learn to read in an African language before switching over to English in grade 4. Because it's really important for children to learn to read in a language that they speak and understand. So what this survey did was it tested all 11 languages. If you're a Zulu child, was in Natal, you would have taken the Zulu test. If you were in the Northwest, you would have written it in Setswana, and so on. So I think what it's showing us is that the pandemic had this incredibly large impact on learning outcomes, but importantly that the Department of Basic Education has also done very little to remediate those learning losses. And I think that's something that we've seen from other countries, and even in the Western Cape, there's a big catch-up program now called Back on Track. They've allocated more than R1 billion to that. But at the moment, there's no plan at the national level to remediate these learning losses. So it doesn't look like it's going to get better anytime soon.
What are the long-term implications?
I think some of the long-term implications of this is that learning to read, and the reason why we call it the foundation phase in grades 1, 2, and 3 is because that's the time when you learn to read. We call it the learning to read phase. And after that, it's the reading to learn phase. So unless you've acquired the skill in the first 3 years of school of how to match speech sounds, what we're doing right now, with printed text on a page or a screen, and that's the process of reading, you really can't engage with the curriculum, you can't engage with content subjects, and you'll fall further and further behind the curriculum. So I think what this is telling us is that if 80% of kids, 81% to be specific, can't read in any language in grade 4, it means that they can't actually access the curriculum. So you've got a sort of two-speed education system where only about 20% of kids have learned how to read, 80% haven't. And when we look at society more broadly, things like percentage of people that are using private healthcare, private security, private education, the two-speed nature of South African society is mirrored in the education system. And I think that the long-term consequences of this is that the education system is just perpetuate a two-speed, highly unequal country. Because if you're sending your child to a fee-charging functional school, public or private, it's less important if it's a public school or a private school. It's more important if it's a fee-charging school or a no-fee school. And I think what these results are showing is that for children in no-fee schools, the quality of education they're receiving is extremely poor. They're not learning how to read, and they're not getting to matric with the kinds of knowledge and skills that they need to go to vocational colleges or universities or get meaningful work. And I think those are actually the long-term consequences of what we're talking about here.
What are the solutions?
I think South Africa is in an extremely fortunate position because we have a very large body of research. We have the largest body of research in the African continent of how you improve early grade reading and maths outcomes. It's not as if maths outcomes are better than the reading outcomes. So I think the first one would be we need to make sure that every single classroom in South Africa has access to the basic resources that teachers need to teach reading. Things like anthologies of graded readers. These are storybooks that are specifically created in a way that teachers use to teach reading. So they're phonically sequenced, they're leveled, they start with stories that only have a very few words. In English, it's often consonant, vowel, consonant words like cat, rat, sap, mat, these very easy words to decode. In African languages, similarly, the way that you teach them requires specific text that teachers currently don't have access to. And we have evidence that when you roll out things like anthologies of graded readers, which the Eastern Cape did in 2019 and 2020, this actually led to an improvement in reading outcomes in isiXhosa in the province. So that would be the first one, is just making sure that there's a minimum set of reading resources for every teacher. But the second one is we have to make sure that teachers actually know how to teach reading. More than half of teachers in South Africa were actually trained under apartheid. More than 50% of South African publicly employed teachers are currently 50 years or older, which means there's also going to be a big retirement wave in the next 10 to 15 years when they reach 60 and 65 and they start retiring. But I think what that means is that those teachers weren't actually trained how to teach reading, what we call the science of reading, how you move from spoken language, phonemic awareness, the ability to hear the sounds in language, blending and segmenting letters and syllables to create words. Just because you can read doesn't mean that you can teach someone to read. And teachers actually need to be taught explicitly. This is how children learn how to read. This is how you use these books, and we're going to give you these books. So there are various ways of doing that. You can do it with centralized teacher training. They've done this in Limpopo with 4 days of training per term. You can do it with teacher coaches in the Eastern Cape and Northwest. They've used expert teacher coaches that actually go and visit teachers in their classroom and teach them how to teach reading. Again, most recently in Limpopo, they've also used teaching assistants, using unemployed youth with matric. They get 4 days of training, they get given workbooks, teachers that they're supporting get given teacher guides, and together over time, over a 2-year period, it actually led to a year's worth of learning that got caught up in 2021 and 2022. So we've got actually quite a lot of evidence of what works to improve reading in South Africa. Problem is those interventions are not being taken up by the Department of Basic Education. They're not being taken to scale. We don't currently have a national reading plan. We don't have a budget for these sorts of things. Today is the 18th of May, and we're meant to be finding out from the Minister of Basic Education what's in the education budget when she tables the budget vote. So I think it'll be really important to see if there are any explicit ring-fenced allocations specifically for reading resources in schools, given this reading crisis that we have on our hands. And it's not as if this was just a COVID thing. Even before COVID, we had a reading crisis, but this has just made it much worse.
What can be done to address the inequality between African schools on the one hand and Afrikaans and English schools on the other hand?
I think addressing educational inequality in South Africa is coming back to the same issues about resourcing and teacher training. Even things like teacher class sizes. Because teacher wages have exceeded inflation for the last 10 years, what we've seen is that there's been an increase in enrollment. There was a birth surge in about 2004 and 2005, and those children then came into the education system, but we didn't hire more teachers. So because of that, class sizes have just been expanding and expanding as those children move through the system, but we haven't been hiring more teachers, and that's concentrated in the no-fee part of the system. So I think equalizing resources and channeling additional resources towards no-fee schools, offering more training opportunities, offering more minimum packages of resources to those schools, those are the ways that we actually can tackle inequality in the education system, as opposed to just going with a business as usual approach, which is our current strategy. I've been saying that extraordinary times require extraordinary measures. And at the moment, we're not implementing any of those extraordinary measures. We're employing a sort of very much a business as usual, back to normal. Let's pretend that nothing happened. Let's pretend we don't have a reading crisis. Kids go to school, teachers go to school, learning happens. I think what these results do is they stop us in our track and they say, listen, what the hell's going on if 80% of kids can't read?
Does the government have the budget to provide quality low-fee education?
So we actually spend nearly 300 billion rand. The 2023 budget vote was nearly 300 billion rand on basic education. That's 5% of GDP. 4% of GDP goes on teacher salaries. So we are spending an incredibly large amount of money on education. And I think the big question is, are we getting value for that spend? How can we measure the outcomes of education? It's not good enough to just pay teacher salaries and send workbooks into children's classrooms and fingers crossed and hope for the best. At the moment, we only have an exam at the primary school, at the secondary school level, the matric exam in grade 12. Whereas I think what we actually need is we also need a primary school exam. Every year in January, we have this huge jamboree in the country where everyone laments about, which province came first in matric, and there's this big ceremony and there's a big envelope and you pull out what's the matric pass rate, and the national attention gets focused on matric. Whereas I think what we know is that the matric results is the end of the system. One of the education officials that I was speaking to, they said, you can't focus on the roof of the house. You have to focus on the foundation. You can't build the roof. You have to build the foundation first before you start building the roof. And matric is the roof. I think what we need is a primary school exam to focus our attention and resources on what's going on in the primary school, and channeling our budget towards that as well. We need an assessment at the primary school level, those resources and training at the primary school level. And we also need to be asking what the universities are doing to be training teachers, because many of the teachers that are coming out of universities are not equipped to teach reading. They don't allocate enough time in their 4-year Bachelor of Education program on the practicalities of how you teach reading. They're doing things like becoming a professional, the psychology of the child, all of these things, without the practicalities of things like classroom management, teaching phonics. How do you teach the 4 operations in mathematics? How do you use these specific workbooks rather than talking about philosophers of education and these sort of esoteric ideas as if they're training researchers? Primarily, they are training teachers that are going into classrooms. They're not training researchers. And I think that's a big mistake we're making in South Africa. Those are some of the recommendations I think that the research and the evidence seems to suggest.
What is the correlation between the low quality of education and unemployment in South Africa?
So I think what we see is a mirroring of the labor market and the education system. So you have this high levels of inequality in the labor market, you have high levels of inequality in the education system, and these two systems are basically feeding each other. If you attend the functional fee part of the system in education, you end up in the top part of the labor market with a formal job, a proper employment contract, etc. Whereas if you attend a no-fee school, the chances of you being unemployed or temporarily employed or precariously employed are much, much higher. So when we're looking at unemployment statistics, I think in the long run, we know that the relationship between education and growth is quite strong. So one of the other countries that participated in this most recent PEARLS assessment was Brazil. And we like to compare ourselves to Brazil, roughly similar levels of economic inequality, same GDP per capita. And what we see in Brazil is that 61% of their kids at the grade 4 level can read, compared to 19% of our kids. So, if we've got roughly similar GDP per capita, how is it that these people are getting so much higher reading outcomes compared to South Africa? In Egypt, 50% of the kids can read. In Jordan, 50% of the kids can read. In South Africa, 19% of the kids can read. So again, these are other middle-income countries that we would normally compare ourselves to. And yet we just have radically poorer and weaker educational outcomes. So if we're looking at the long term and trying to understand what can we do to tackle unemployment, inequality, those sorts of things, you really have to look at the root of this and realize that the skills base of the economy is being generated in the education system. And that's extremely unequal and extremely, it's not only unequal, it's also low. It's low and unequal. And I think until we tackle both of those things, we raise the average quality of schooling and decrease inequality, we're not going to see changes in the labor market, whether that's employment or economic growth.
What can the private sector do to help?
I think the private sector, there's various ways that it can help. The philanthropic sector, corporate social investment, those sorts of things. I think what's critical, though, is that we don't see private sector involvement as, I call it, throwing starfish back into the sea. These are my 5 schools. These are the 10 schools we work with, Vodacom or Telkom or whoever gives them laptops, or they try and do some teacher training program, and it's like a feel-good, warm and fuzzy in your heart type of thing. That's not going to help very much. I think what we need to do is recognize that those sorts of interventions, corporate social investments at schools, needs to be aimed at how do we influence what government is doing. Let's try and implement an intervention in 20 schools or 30 schools, but not just to help those 20 schools, to try and understand how this model of training teachers to teach reading, for example, could work. Once you realize how it works, or if it doesn't work, you make sure that those findings feed into the national policy discussion and what the Department of Basic Education is doing. So I think we need fewer interventions that are just micro interventions helping this small little community, and we need more interventions that are actually being rigorously evaluated and informing what's happening at scale. We have 15,000 primary schools in the country. Corporate social investment is a drop in the bucket. Average corporate social investment in the country is about 5 billion rand a year, which sounds like a lot until you realize that the government is spending 300 billion rand a year. So you're never going to solve this problem with the 5 billion rand of corporate social investment. I think the best use of private money is influencing how public money is spent. So we have to use that 5 billion rand of corporate social investment to influence how that 300 billion rand that government is spending on education. And the way that happens is through rigorous evidence and documenting programs that actually work, that are within government's budget, within the political realities that we face. And that would be my advice to the private sector.
Thank you, Professor Spaull. Thank you for taking us through the progress in international reading literacy study.
Thanks for having me.